WBJC-FM presents Inside Gene Shepard.
Tonight is culture night here at this old sordid corner of the world. Thank God. It's culture night, so get ready for it. Tighten your belt, squint your eyes, pull in your gut. Well, I really mean that. It is culture night here tonight. And what makes culture? It's a good question. And no one's ever been able to define that. Is culture Archie Bunker getting a #1 rating? Or is culture the Daily News? Well, who knows? You know, culture is culture. You know, culture is what it is. It's whatever you define it to be, actually, I'm afraid. It's so complex and so multifaceted. Is let's say Arthur Miller, is he reflecting life in America any more than I am? Well, depends on whether you're an Arthur Miller fan. Oh, really? It really does. And that don't mean that egotistically. I mean, is, let's say, Tennessee Williams reflecting life in our time any more than, let's say, Mary Tyler Moore? Tough question. Not a simple question. And you know, a lot of people tend to make it this simple. Oh, yes, of course, Tennessee Williams is not necessarily. Because there are a lot of famous writers of the 19th century which are today totally unknown to anybody, even literary historians who were very big at the time. Yeah, have you ever tried to wander through some of the novels that were written at that time? And the people who were not taken seriously often at that period have emerged as the voices that are still read. Among them, Ambrose Bierce, hardly known to people of his time. You know the name Bierce? You know, there's dozens of other examples. But what makes culture? Well, it's whatever at the time turns you on. And you know, the reason I got on this kick tonight, thinking about it, was because there's a current trend that should be reported on. Nobody said much about it, but I'm reporting on it, and that is a sudden trend among many screenwriters and TV people to, without giving credit, by the way, often, in fact, most often without giving credit, to draw upon not only the writings, but the characters and the attitudes of people who were unknown writers of the 30s, pulp writers specifically. Now, for example, many people seeing Chinatown were not probably aware that many of the lines in Chinatown, just actual lines spoken by the character, came right out of a writer who wrote originally mystery stories in pulp magazines of the 30s. There was no credit, as far as I know, given to him. They just, and they also took the character. The character was taken, renamed though. The character that Nicholson played in that movie was a character that had been created in all aspects, almost all specific and many subtle aspects, by Raymond Chandler. The original character was called Philip Marlowe. Now, but that happens to be a famous case, but there are many, many other cases where you'll see this series, you say, oh, it's a great series, but they took it from an even lesser-known writer, maybe of the period, that didn't get, after all, Raymond Chandler was famous, that there were a lot of pulp writers who never emerged out of that misty world of the pulp writer. See, because Chandler, late in his career, after having written for many years for really rotten magazines, I mean, magazines that were sold for a dime, he was paid by the word, not by the story. He was paid by if you wrote like a penny a word, and if you wrote a 200-word page, you got 200 pennies. That's right. It was about a penny and a half a word. So a guy would write 5,000 words, and what would he get? He'd get $5. You know, so it was a hard, tough life. These guys were grinding it out. Now, he happened to get famous because late in his career, he took a lot of his short stories and made them then into novels. He took the original short stories and turned it into a series of novels which sold enormously. But had he not done that, his short stories would have disappeared into the great yellowed pulp pages of anonymity, except that they would be continually be redone by various other screenwriters. But he'd never get credit. So this is one of those fascinating things, and there is a current trend to take these guys, because they were really writing in a curious way much more vital literature, vital in the sense of dramatic content, in the sense of in a sense, setting a trend for a whole new thing to come in later years, and in more highly paid and better-known writers. They were starting a thing which at that time was certainly not very, at any point, respectable. And so many of them wrote under 15 different names. In fact, I remember one time running into a guy, a funny guy, who wrote. He was a professional hack, and he knew it. He was a hack. That's what he was. And he wrote for pulp magazines. Now, there were times, he wrote under so many different names, there were times that an entire pulp magazine would come out, let's say Mystery Fiction or Argosy, one of these big pulp magazines of that period, would arrive, and he had written every story in it under a different name. and there would be letters to the editors. See, in the first part, it would say, hey, that was a rotten story by Joe Walton. Let's have more stories by Dynamite McGinn. That was a fantastic story. Of course, he wrote both of them. They were the same guy. And so he used to sit there, and he just turned this stuff out, and he was one of the few guys who had an actual contract from a pulp publisher that they paid him whether he sent in anything or not. He was that prolific, though. He did, you know. They just sent him a check every month, and he turned this stuff out by the yard. Now, a lot of it was dross, but a lot of it was great too, you know, because their mind worked so freely. They would turn out great stuff, and at the same time they would turn out bad stuff. They just turned it all out, is what they did. Now, there's one aspect of pulp fiction. Right now, we're going through the detective aspect. In other words, the private eye aspect, that practically all the characters that are being stolen from pulp fiction of that period are private eyes. Well, I'm making a prediction that within the next couple of years, they're going to start stealing other characters out of that, and a whole new genre will develop. Because the most popular pulp magazines of that period, according to friends of mine, and don't think for one minute that I was writing for that, because I was a little kid. All I know is what I have learned since from people I know who are in the publishing industry about this field, fascinating field. That the most popular stories of that time were not detective stories. That's what surprised me. You would think that Doc Savage would be the most read of all of them, or something like, probably Argosy, detective fiction, which was another one. Because today we talk most about cops, but they were not the most popular stories of the period in the pulp fiction. And I'll let you think for a minute just what you would consider would be the most popular. They sold far more than The Detective. And what would you think they would be? Now, all right, I'll tell you what they were. There were two genres of pulp fiction. Now, I don't know why I'm doing this tonight, except that it fascinates me. You know, our writings, our American writings, we developed this field almost exclusively. You know that the pulp genre of fiction, it developed really in a way in two countries, England and America, but not quite the same way. In the early days of pulp fiction in England, it was a very different kind of pulp fiction. It was pulp fiction about the maid who falls in love with the lord in the castle, you know, in the manor house, and the adventures therein, or the lost heir to the Twigglesworth fortune. This would be the kind of stuff they went for. It was all class oriented, much of it anyway. It was in America that the genre of the outlaw began to develop back in the right after the Civil War. The outlaw stories, what they called dime novels and all that stuff began to develop, and it was mostly developed around the West. There were all kinds of characters that were written about. Buffalo Bill became a character in Pulp Fiction, although he was a real character. There were a lot of other characters that grew out of the West. What was one of them? Do you know any of them? Who? Well, we're giving a little quiz here, a little literary quiz here. There were guys named Deadeye, and there were all kinds of great characters. Many of them were lawmen, and then of course later on the cult of the romantic outlaw developed, the Billy the Kid cult, and so on. And this was all the cowboys and Indians was a big thing. And then about the turn of the century, of course, Horatio Alger wrote a whole series of pulp novels for kids. And those were pulp novels, really, in a very real sense. And you know, is it interesting to note that here's a guy, Horatio Alger, who was never recognized by the literary world of his time. I mean, he was just a little guy sitting down there turning his stuff out and turning them out like popcorn. You know, the story of Sam the Young Shortstop, or A Hard Life's Climb to Fame, that kind of stuff. And yet, of all the writers of the period, he is probably one of the most well-known writers worldwide of all those writers who were famous at the period. People know the name Horatio Alger who never read his stuff. It's just, they say a Horatio Alger story. Well, he's become so famous that a lot of people would be surprised to know there really was a Horatio Alger, you know, who walked around and put a hat on every day, went out and got a sandwich. And Horatio Alger did all this stuff, but he wrote them out. You know, he wrote these things as dime novels, and his life was almost the opposite of the characters that he created, which has always been the case with many writers. So this doesn't show he's a phony. What it does show is that literature is often an escape for both the reader and the writer. So you'll find a lot of novels today about this fantastic stud. He has these incredible sexual adventures. And in a dynamic world, you know, the American Dream Syndrome of Norman Mailer. Fantastic. Exactly the opposite of the writer. The writer's living this scene himself. I've known of guys who've written, you know, dynamic war novels, who spent the entire time they were in the Army turning out mimeographed orders for other guys. And it's a mythology, both shared by the reader, and it's what life's about. So face it, Shakespeare was not a Prince of Denmark. So it's a shared fantasy. Well, then later, they began to develop another kind of dime novel. Are you interested in all this? There was another kind that grew. It was a fascinating type that grew as technology became important in the world. Prior to the Civil War, of course, technology was a very small part of most people's lives. They lived on the farm. It was pretty basic life. Well, then after the Civil War, technology began to have a real impact on people's lives, and the riverboats and so on. And Mark Twain, you know, his first fame was established because he was famous as a pilot of riverboats. And his name, Mark Twain, of course, comes from that. This is a boat term, a riverboat term. Mark Twain, meaning it's a call that is made when they're measuring the depth of the water. They will holler Mark 6, Mark 4, Mark Twain. And he took that name because he was a riverboat pilot, which made him a highly romantic character to the people who lived on the farms. And this great machine going by was a very complicated, highly sophisticated piece of romantic gear. Mark Twain and being a riverboat pilot was roughly the same as, say, a guy today starting to write fiction, and he is as an astronaut, or he is more closely probably, he's a 747 pilot. And it's a very romantic kind of thing in a highly complex technical field, and this is what Twain was. Later on, his first stories, by the way, made his fame in that field. He wrote river stories. Life on the Mississippi was one of his first big hits as a popular writer of the period. And the fact that he was a pilot made it really even more exciting. So he would talk about life on the Mississippi. So the technology began to be part of the life of the people, that is, the readers, and they began fascinated by it. We take technology so much for granted today that it seems surprising to us that there was a time, and within the lifetime of people that are still alive around us, where technology simply was not known. They didn't have it. The simplest kind of technology, like turning on a light. I mean, we don't think of this as technology. We just turn the lights on, that's all. But, you know, the idea of electric lights coming to a town, well, must have been fantastically dramatic the first time it hit. And the idea of a machine that moved without a horse or without somebody pushing it must have been like magic, you know, to see the first car go through the town. And I'm sure that there are people listening to who remember that vaguely, because that wasn't that long ago, historically. Certainly the first airplanes didn't fly where people could actually see them till roughly around the time of World War I, and maybe even after. And for a long time after World War I, well into the 20s, the idea of seeing an airplane fly overhead was one of the biggest things that could happen to a guy in his whole year, because they didn't have transcontinental flights that went all the time. And once in a while, if you were living in probably a place like North Dakota and an airplane flew over, well, they were way off the beaten path, and that was a sight, you know. So the impact of technology changed literature, pop literature. And it may surprise a lot of people to know that the most popular pulp fiction of the 20s and 30s, the pulp magazines, was not the detective or the Fu Manchu stories or any of those, but was, for example, there was a magazine called Railroad Stories, which was enormously popular. And it was about railroad men, because railroad men were very romantic to people who lived out on the prairies, and they'd see this great this limited roar through at 2 in the morning, and these guys who just lived those great roaring lives, moving across the land, they seemed to be to those people, they seemed to be almost like out of another world. They at one morning they'd be in New York, and the next morning they're in Chicago. I mean, to the average guy, his one trip that he once made to the county seat was the biggest trip he ever made. Do you know that in this country today, this may surprise you, it did me when I found out about it, and these are actual FAA CAB figures that were recently released within the past year. Do you know that less than 10% of the population in America has ever flown in an airplane? Okay? And you're going to say, oh, that's ridiculous. It happens to be a truth. Happens to be the actual figures released by the CAB. And furthermore, this may even interest you more, that even a tiny percentage of people have ever actually flown more than 200 miles from their home. That would really surprise you, that many, many people never travel out of their hometown. The one trip they make to Yellowstone is talked about all their lives, and they have pictures of it, and they show that's right now, 1974. We're not talking of the past. So the nation really is divided into two very distinct groups. There's the people who are part of the 20th century life as we know it, and then there's the great vast majority who see it only on television. And that's their contact with 20. They don't take part in it. They just sit and watch it. And the idea of flying in it, well, I know people here at the station that have never flown. I can name them. You may be surprised to know who they are. So anyway, back in the 30s, technology was the most fascinating thing to people, and it was a great dream world. It was a fantasy world. The detective world wasn't a fantasy world. Not at all. There was a cop on every corner, So what fantasize, The world of the technology. And here, right here, is one of the most successful magazines in all of pulp history, right here. And I'm predicting that within a couple of years, there will be writers who will begin to create series around the characters that were created by these people who wrote in this magazine. Right here. And this is an actual copy, and this one happens to be the August 1932 issue of this magazine. It's quite a valuable magazine. There aren't many of them that exist today because, see, early in the collecting world, collectors collected Doc Savage. They collected, let's say, comic strip magazines and all this. They were quite easy to collect. But these did not get collected, and so there aren't many of them in existence. This happens to be in mint condition, as you can see. It's got the front, everything. It's beautiful, even including the back binding is still here. How it's lasted this long, I don't know, but it is a magazine from 1932, and it is the one of the 2 or 3 most successful magazines in the history of pulp magazining. If I were on TV, I'd hold it up there for you. And it is one based on technology, but technology and combined with war. Now, I'll let you think what the name of the magazine was if you're an expert out there. Okay, the magazine is called Flying Aces. It was a great magazine in its period, and I have a mint copy of it here, which is very highly prized on the collector's market. And there were other magazines in that same genre, because flying was something that hardly anybody did in 1932. The idea of flying in 1932, after all, that was only how many years? That was like 4 or 5 years after Lindbergh made his famous flight. And the idea of flying in an airplane was a highly sophisticated idea. And World War I had just had finished, had been over. Let's see, 1918 was the end of the war, roughly. So that would make it about 14 years before World War I was over. And by the time World War I was over, of course, it had become sort of a mythological war by this time. It had become romantic. And so they could write stories about it by now. And this was about the aces of World War I, who were still flying around in America and barnstorming, doing a lot of barnstorming in the pastures and stuff, and flying Jennies and DH-4s. And here's the sound, by the way, of a World War I aircraft engine of that period, if you'll bring it on there. This is the sound of probably one of the most famous engines of the period. There are several of these in the Smithsonian, and there are collectors. There's a club, in fact, devoted to collecting this type of engine. It was the engine that not only was part of World War I, but it became the engine that powered the early mail planes that flew across the country. Among the male pilots that were very famous of the period was Charles Lindbergh. He was a famous pilot in that world, and these guys did incredible feats of flying. I mean, they flew enormously dangerous. They flew out of Teterboro, by the way. They also flew out of Caldwell Wright, which was a famous airport in those days over here in New Jersey. It still exists. And the engine that Lindbergh flew was tested over there when he flew his flight to Paris. But this engine that you're listening to is a famous engine of that period. That's all right. It'll go off and on. They're blipping it around. Don't worry about it. That engine was the Liberty engine, the so-called Liberty engine, which flew in the de Havilland 4 or the DH-3, DH-4 aircraft, which became they were bombers, and where the de Havilland, of course, was a British plane, but the Liberty was an American engine, was built in America. And here now you hear another sound. This is another type of aircraft engine. Just keep it going there. This is another one, but this one is flying over, and you can hear it in the distance. That's the sound of a Sopwith Camel. And so the sound of an aircraft, that was a different type of engine, but the Liberty engine was famous and fascinating. And the sounds of these engines were very important to the people at the time. Now, that spawned a literature. It really did. And here is this great literature, and reading this, you can see how the romance must have been of the time. And you can also see, too, how tough the world must have been economically for people. For example, here's an ad on the back page here of the magazine. It's a full-page ad. And the ad says, "Which is the job for you?" And there are 3 jobs that you can train for, by mail, by the way, for this outfit. 3 jobs, and you can't imagine anybody training for these jobs by mail. The jobs were: 1, laborer. You can train by mail to be a laborer, clerk. And they offer as a result of taking this mail course. It was an outfit called the Public Service Educational Institute of North America. How's that for a name of an outfit? And they said in the ad, the ad right here says that you can earn upwards of $100 a month if you are lucky and you really study hard. So you can see things were pretty tough. Now, here are some of the stories in this month's magazine, August 1932, and it's called Air Stories by Real Airmen. And that was another thing. Most of the guys that wrote these stories were ex-pilots. That's what added to it. For example, one of them is written by a famous guy who was credited with 16 victories in World War I. And he's still around, and he's a friend of Ed Fitzgerald here on the station, by the way. And he's a famous writer in the genre, a man named Arch Whitehouse. And he had a story in this one called Happy Landings. Here's another story, Monster of the Mist, a complete novel in this month. Every month had a complete novel, Monster of the Mist. And you want to hear a description of the novel. And it's a complete in this issue, written by Stuart M. Emery. Now, who knows who Stuart M. Emery was? That could very well have been another name for almost anybody, from Edgar Rice Burroughs to John Steinbeck, because a lot of guys worked at this. But it was Stuart Emery, and here is the let's say the thumbprint picture of the novel. Quote: "Every man at GHQ was gripped with horror at the tale that the lone pilot told. 17 pilots have dived down through the mist over that German airfield and had never been seen again." A gripping mystery novel. They combined mystery with the war, you see. Here were 17 planes that dove down to strafe an airport, and they disappeared and were never seen again. And this is the Monster of the Mist, a complete novel. The next story is humor. They had a lot of humor in these, and one of the most famous humor writers of the period in the field of aircraft, in the field of World War I airplane fiction, was a guy named Joe Archibald. Now, he was legendary. Really, he was. To readers of Pulp Fiction of that time, and I've talked to editors around, the name Joe Archibald had as much clout on the front of a Flying Aces or a G8 in his Battle Aces magazine of that period than if, say, today you were to have on the front of your magazine an exclusive, first-time ever told story by Norman Mailer, who rips aside the curtain of sham over Philip Roth. I mean, he was big, potent box office, and that was Joe Archibald. And he created characters, and one of his most famous character was a guy called Phineas Pinkham. Phineas Pinkham was a famous character who ran through all of his stories. He was like a humor character, like say Tom Sawyer, and he was a World War I pilot. And his story this month is called Spy a la Mode by Joe Archibald. And here is the description of the story. Phineas Carbuncle Pinkham was beginning to wonder if a sense of humor wasn't a handicap, but it took a lot to make him feel that way. Often I feel that way too. Sense of humor is a handicap. And I'll read you the opening sentence of that story so you get an idea what it sounded like. On page 54, Phineas Pinkham takes off. And it's a short story. It's only 4 or 5. Oh, wait a minute. Here it is. Oh, it's longer than that. Here it is. Phineas Pinkham. A Phineas Pinkham howl, it's described. By Joe Archibald, who is the editor or the author of Hair Tonic. Oh, God. Hair Tonic. That's H-E-R-R. Hair Tonic. No Money, No Fly-E, etc. For the first time in his life, Phineas Carbuncle Pinkham wondered if a sense of humor wasn't a handicap. to a man who aspired to grow a long white beard and play with his grandchildren. That was always the ambition of all pilots of that period, to live to have grandchildren. They hardly ever did. It says it had taken a lot to make him that way, just a little matter of assaulting a colonel. Now here's the opening of the story. The Spad, warming up in front of A Flight's hangar, intrigued Colonel William Q. Woolsey. The brass hat had recently been assigned to the general staff at Chateaumont, and business of much importance had brought him to the drome of the 9th Pursuit Squadron, Major Rufus Garrity commanding. This business concluded, Colonel Woolsey had wandered out of wings to take a look-see at how and for what reason an airdrome percolated. The Spad was as much an attraction to the aforementioned colonel as a talking machine is to a tribe of Zulus. He approached it and grinned broadly at a tall, homely-looking specimen of the genus Homo, who leaned indolently against the battle bus, giving instructions to a pair of grease monkeys. The verbal barrage was punctuated with rich, ripe adjectives. As 2 or 3 of these floated over to Colonel Woolsey, he frowned, shoved out his jaw another notch, and increased his pace. "I say," he snapped as he drew up, "is that the proper language for an officer to use? By gad, I've never heard worse in a mule skinner's outfit." Phineas Pinkham, Lieutenant Phineas Carbuncle Pinkham, saluted briskly, his face turning an appearance of nausea. "You never heard as good? It's the only language these here bums know." And there's a couple of blanks. If Major Garrity had not been delving into very profound problems of his own, he might have taken the time and trouble to, and that was the beginning of the story, introducing Phineas Pinkham, famous character, by the way. The next story in this great magazine of the period is another complete novelette. This one called Periscope Pond, a complete novelette written by Syl McDowell. And the description of that story is, only one man could save that shipload of Yanks from the grim menace of Buoy 13, and that man was a deserter from the Yank Air Force overseas. That's called Periscope Pond. And here's another one. Baraka leads a raid on the Austrians. This happens to be a true story. In every issue they would have a story of a true raid that occurred. It was like history. Baraka leads a raid on the Austrians, a thrilling story of this month's cover by the artist, Paul Bissell. The artist drew the thing, which shows a very early raid of bombing planes on Austria, and that was the feature so-called non-fiction story in that particular issue. But this is a fascinating magazine, and a lot of people don't even know of the existence of these. But back in that period, there were several of that type. There was Daredevil Aces was another famous one. All of these came really from the same publishers. There were 2 or 3 publishers who did them. Daredevil Aces, G8 and his Battle Aces would make a classic, I would say a classic, sort of a spoof spy World War I aircraft TV series today. G8 was a secret agent who was also an ace. And even in his squadron, they did not know that he was an agent. He was a spy. And that was his number, G8. Just like, 007. He was G8. And he had this squadron. He was always fighting Baron von Richthofen and strange, sinister counter spies from the German side. And that was a famous series. Daredevil Aces, and the one I just read to you was the most famous of all, and it was called Flying Aces. And the subtitle of the magazine was Biggest and Best Air Magazine. And the big issue in that issue, that particular feature in that issue, was Baron von Richthofen's life in pictures. And inside they had a whole series of drawings and paintings of von Richthofen. And there are some guys that are still around today, for example. Here's one who still writes for science fiction. You see his name occasionally in SF, a guy named Lester Dent. Well, Lester Dent wrote a story in that issue called 4 to 1. Blazing hangars and a pitted tarmac marked the havoc those daring Fokker raiders had made. But the bomb that did the most damage to the airdrome of the 88th Yank Squadron was a dud bomb that did not explode. An exciting mystery story. 4 to 1 by Lester Dent. Now, that genre has gone almost completely undiscovered by collectors, and yet, maybe because they're very difficult to come by, very few of those magazines survive today. And yet, millions of them were sold. How much did it cost? This was 20 cents. 20 cents an issue, which was considered at that time a very expensive magazine. It was almost twice, well, it was twice the price of magazines like Doc Savage and like Argosy, and then magazines like Fu Manchu was a series at that time. But this was an elegant magazine. Elegant, well, it's hard to say whether it was elegant or not. But it certainly had life and vitality. Look at that cover. I mean, that cover should be framed right there. You know, put a frame around it, man. Hey, you got yourself a piece of business. And the ads in it alone. Here's an ad and say, "No more shaving. A new discovery. Put this stuff on your face, and your hair doesn't grow." What a flim-flam that was.